Okay, let me guys can go through them if you want. All right, and next up, we're going to be, we have our creative shorts fellow, DJ Peaches, and she'll be talking about her shorts, Holding Hands.
Yate, she Deidre Peaches Yanishia, Todichini Nishlin Lokadene Bashashin, Ashihin Dashache, Todichini Dashanele, Kinslanade Hoyede Nasha. Hello, Yate Bene, good morning. My name is Deidre Peaches. That's my formal introduction in Navajo, saying that I come from Bitterwater and Reed people, and my Che is from the Salt people, and my Nully, which is my paternal grandfather, is also Bitterwater. And I'm currently residing in Flagstaff, Arizona. So I'm here today to talk about my short film that's currently in pre-production. The name of the film is Holding Hands. And the brief summary of the film is particularly following the narrative of Christina. Christina is a young Indigenous woman. She's going off to college, and in packing her things and everything, she's feeling a lot of sadness and grief for the recent passing of her grandmother. And so in the story, Christina's grandmother comes back to life due to unknown supernatural circumstances. And in the process, her grandmother teaches her the resiliency of her ancestors, and also teaches her about her clan origin, which is Nakaidene. And so through this experience, she learns about her father and her father's traumatic past, that her grandma didn't share this information with him. And so by reconnecting with her grandma, she's able to heal these relationships within her own intergenerational relationships with her father too, as well, by knowing where that has come from, as far as her not knowing her connection to her culture. And so currently our film is in pre-production. We have done location scouting in the areas of Kayenta, which is near Monument Valley, as well as the Grand Falls region, which is close to Flagstaff. And all of these locations have direct ties to myself and also the co-director and lead, or the head writer of the film. And a lot of this film too stems from experiences that have been that we all have felt, as far as being a young Indigenous Native person and really wanting to learn more about the culture, learning more about who are, or my identity of sorts. And yeah, so currently we're in pre-production. We've done location scouting. This coming month, we're going to be doing an open casting call, as well as doing crowdfunding. I'm still applying for multiple grants in the process. Applied to a grant called Through Her Lens, which is with Tribeca and Chanel. Also have made ties with the Black Magic Design, and they're going to allocate a Frixis 6K, which is their new camera for the project. And so currently still in the beginning phases of pre-production, and looking forward to going on to production and post. And we're slated to have the project completed in July, August of next year. Thank you.
All right, good job, Deidre. And we would like to welcome to the stage for session 2 for Our History is Our Future with Katrina, Dan, and Lily. That will be moderated by Phil Hoffman.
Good morning. Good morning to everybody on Whova. So please remember you can ask questions and type them in. We'd love to have your questions here. I'm Dr. Phil Hoffman. I am a board member here at Vision Maker Media, and I am also Assistant Dean of Media and General Manager of Ball State Public Media, which is in Indiana, just a little bit north of Indianapolis. So thank you for being here this morning. We appreciate you all being here. The title of this session is really talking about our history is our future, and we want to welcome the folks here on the panel today. So with us this morning, we have Katrina Jagodinsky, who is currently the University of Nebraska's Department of History and College of Law's expert on media and legal history with Indigenous folks. And we're also joined by Dan Bigbee and Lily Shangreaux, who are producers, and they're talking about kind of a production that they're working on currently. So we'll talk a little bit about more about that in a minute. But first, I wanted to take a minute and have each person introduce themselves a little bit. So let's start, Dan, with you, and you can just kind of give us a brief bio.
Hello, everyone. Glad to see so many people here. Of course, my name's Dan Bigbee. Me and my wife Lily have been running big productions for since what, 93? Something like that. Actually made a living in production. Can you imagine that? I did my very first professional video production in 1977. So I've been doing this for quite a while. And I got involved with PBS and public media in the early 80s when I was finished my tour in the Navy and ended up in Nebraska. My first PBS job was with ETV in Lincoln, Nebraska. And that's where I met Frank Blythe. And he was starting the, well, it's been through what, 3 iterations now, starting that organization with the intent of seeing more Native stories on PBS. And I remember part of the real challenge at that time was that the white folks in PBS didn't think Indians could do it. Didn't think we could produce at the national level that was required to be on national PBS. And there were several of us that made it a point to prove them wrong. And I think that seeing all you here, particularly the young faces, is more evidence they were fucking wrong.
Thank you, Dan. I also discovered, as Dan and I were talking last night, we were both post-production rats with a long history going back to Micropolis hard drives, which means nothing to anybody here but me and Dan. So thank you, Dan. Katrina.
First of all, thanks to everybody for being here today, and also to Vision Maker for the invitation to participate. This is one of those constant moments of realizing what a small world we all live in, because I grew up in northern Wisconsin and spent a lot of time on Menominee Nation, but only met Jacob last night at dinner. And I'm really excited to see these kinds of multimedia stories being produced and coming from Indigenous storytellers. As I mentioned, growing up in northern Wisconsin, I just benefited from a family that was really committed to social justice activism. And so my mom would take me to rallies and to be witness at some of what's come to be known as the Walleye Wars, where Ojibwe and Menominee nations were working to reassert treaty rights in the 1990s. So I grew up around Native leaders who, you know, just comfortably went back and forth between narrating treaty law and treaty history, but also family history and protocol and oral tradition. And so I naively thought that that must be how scholars think about Native law and history. So as a non-Native person, I went to undergrad thinking that I would work actually in environmental studies. I wanted to work on wetland protection, just again, coming from that environment of really understanding both the cultural as well as environmental reasons to steward and protect resources, but pretty quickly realized that I was more interested in story. And so in pursuing history and law, I ended up getting a master's in American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona, taught at a tribal college for a few years, worked for a tribal nonprofit, and then wanted to make research my focus. So I'm currently associate professor of history at University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and most of my research focuses on the 19th century. And my day-to-day work is reading case files from local courts where Indigenous women in particular are really active in both making claims for themselves, but also their families and communities. And so that's kind of how I ended up here at this point.
Thank you, Katrina. Lily.
Testing? Oh, there it is. My name is Lily Shangreaux. I am a member of the Oglala Lakota Nation. I was born and raised in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, until I went to college in 1964. No, 70, I'm sorry. And I came to video production late in life when I married Dan. I am a grants writer. That's what I have done for a living for 40, 50 years. I started doing it with writing grants for an urban Indian center. I moved to the Institute of American Indian Arts and helped raise millions for their new campus and the museum that they renovated in downtown Santa Fe. Met Dan and married in 92, and when the company he was working for changed hands, we had a heart-to-heart conversation in the backyard at the house, and I was saying, well, what is it you want to do? I had gotten tired of writing for other people. And so we started Big Productions, and for 15 years, I wrote grants for us. And most recently, I worked for an engineering consulting firm that designs broadband systems for rural America and has worked with tribes both in this state and throughout the country developing broadband systems for reservation areas, from microwave to fiber to satellite, whatever it takes, to hook us up in Indian country, which is something I'm really grateful I got a chance to do. I retired in more or less December a year ago. And we've been building our cabin out in their Lake Tenkiller in Cherokee country. And then Fran said, you should come to this producer summit. So we said, okay. So here we are. Well, actually, we been working with Katrina on the legal, I forget what the name of this topic is, but I'm a little nervous. And here I am.
Thank you, Lily. So that's a perfect segue. We're talking about this project, the U.S. Law and Race Initiative, which is a project that is in Katrina's wheelhouse at UNL, funded by the Mellon Foundation. Dan and Lily are amongst the first folks, producers that are funded through that project. So Katrina, can you kind of give us the background of how this project came to be and what its intentions are?
Yeah, so the photo behind me represents some of our team at University of Nebraska, Lincoln. We are a consortium of law faculty and history faculty. There are a few others among us who aren't pictured here, but we came together a few years ago concerned about a national public conversation that seemed to assume that law and race were separate, and that legal histories that focus on race had been sort of a recent construction or a recent obsession of certain scholars. I think for those of you who work in the educational space, you might recognize here some of the anti-crit curricular regulations that restrict certain histories from being taught in both the K through 12 and also the higher ed environment. And as scholars working in a variety of areas, but focused in particular on the way in which in the United States and in other settler colonial nations, the law really has been used to define and articulate race and then build those definitions to support inequality. So that's one of the sort of historical principles that all of us work within. But then also acknowledging and really focusing on the way in which marginalized communities have persistently pushed back against the structural inequality within the law. And so we put together a proposal for the Mellon Foundation in their higher ed initiatives to propose a model that would focus on developing curriculum for undergraduates and graduates around the history of U.S. law and race. So that's one of the arms of the project. We're also building what's called an open educational resource, which is a series of modules that put these historic documents in conversation with one another so that audiences and educators can really see and be in direct contact with the documentation of this process of linking law and race, and also, again, various communities' responses to these legal measures. And then the third piece is to partner with communities and constituents and to develop stories about these legal histories that can be capable of reaching a broader audience and also reflecting those community perspectives and experiences. And so being based in University of Nebraska-Lincoln, it was an immediate thought that we should be asking Vision Maker if they wanted to partner with us in developing Indigenous legal histories. And so Francine was very responsive to that and really helped us to craft this call for proposals. And so essentially we are looking for over the course of the next 2.5 to 3 years, producing 2 documentary shorts that focus on not just Indigenous legal histories, but the underrepresented Indigenous legal histories. We want to really emphasize that you know, for a mainstream audience, there are these sort of exceptional cases, perhaps Supreme Court cases, or perhaps, I know in Nebraska, Standing Bear story is really prominent. But we wanted to get the message out that Indigenous people in the United States have been actively engaging courts since day one, first of all. Secondly, that it's not just treaty making, but it's also very local use of courts. And to demonstrate just the depth of Indigenous legal sophistication, which of course varies by tribal nation and region based on what it is that they're responding to and what their needs are. And so that's the goal with this particular initiative.
So part of this, of course, is funding, right? But the other part of it, we were having a drink last night and talking about some of the pieces of this project and how you can support filmmakers. One of the things Dan got very excited about last night is not only is it funding, but it's also maybe some research help and things like that. Can you talk a little bit, Dan or Katrina, about that part of it as it affects the project, the support that you can get with the students who are doing some of that work?
So there's sort of 2 pieces of it. There's the filmmaker and production side, which I think is most visible in the call. There's $25,000 set aside for each of these documentary shorts, and a lot of that is administered through Vision Maker in a way that models a lot of their other filmmaking programs. But what makes this one unique is that we are also offering to filmmakers the archival expertise and the research expertise of not just our faculty, but also graduate research assistants. And so for me, one of the great things about being a historian is that day in and day out, I'm reading just remarkable stories of individual people who are making really sophisticated and complex claims. And I know over and over that I'm actually, and members of our team are the first ones to even open these case files since they were filed 100+ years ago. And we are reaching out to filmmakers because we want to make sure that if we are perhaps the first ones to reopen these case files, we certainly aren't the last ones to then know about. But we also know that very few people get access to those archives, even when they're public archives. Many of you know it's extremely expensive to access those places. They're, we talked about Indigenous protocols in the last panel. Archival protocols are extremely alienating. And so if you haven't been trained in that, if you haven't been sort of offered the networks of access, then it can be difficult for someone who may have passion and interest, but do they have necessarily the sort of training to be able to broker some of that access? And so that's what we're offering to filmmakers in this partnership, is that if you want to tell a really powerful story, but you haven't necessarily been able to access the historical side of that, then that's what we want to help you do.
So the project that you're working on as a team is a project titled For My Children. Can you talk a little bit about the story and why you chose this subject?
Well, we looked at, Dan and I are both products of mixed race marriages, and our parents married each other back in the day when there were still miscegenation laws on all the books in many states. And so what our parents did was illegal and could have resulted in some of the same sorts of actions that the women who we're talking about in this piece experienced. They were the daughters of mixed race marriages back in the 1800s, late 1800s. Their fathers were white, their mothers were Native. And when their fathers died, these children were disinherited by the white families of their fathers. And they took it to court. And in one instance, she won and lost. And in the second instance, I think she won. And but it still took the resources to be able to fight it. In the first instance, the woman died in poverty. I mean, it had nothing. Despite the fact that the money was made on her tribal lands, on her reservation. And it could easily have been us. And it probably was our grandparents and great-grandparents. I mean, my father was an Englishman, and I don't know what happened there. I don't know what, if anything, if his children were, he had two families. He had my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and then he had a white family too. And I don't know what happened there. It's something I'd really like to know. So I have a vested interest in this sort of issue in Indian country, because it's probably happened more times than these two to people you know.
So my wife works with me. I produce documentaries. She works with me on documentaries as we work together on those documentaries. I'm wondering, Dan, what's it like to work as a married couple on a documentary, and are you always wrong?
Brand always tells me I'm wrong. Well, what's it like? I think, well, I believe we're a unique couple. Start with mutual respect. If someone's got an idea, hear it out, and then go from there. We're also a pretty good team in that we've divided the labor up pretty well. Lily does a lot of the research. She does a lot of the writing. And I take over with the camera and coordinate the interviewing and that sort of thing. So the division of labor and respecting the boundaries of those divisions is key to it. And I think that's probably the case with anybody doing any kind of production, you've got to have a team. You can't do it by yourself. And you got to hire people and work with people that, first of all, you respect, establish those boundaries, and work together as a team to come up with the best possible product. And that's the way we work.
We were kind of asked the same question when we were working on the Great American Foot Race, and ITVS funded us. And our program officer said, well, how do you resolve a difference of opinion? And we said, we let the Queen decide. He's got this Canadian coin. It's got the Queen on one side and the bear on the other. And if we really can't, come to grips with one or the other, we flip a coin. Best 2 out of 3. Works every time.
It works. So one of the things I think is
Let me add one more comment. You guys got to remember, it's not life or death. Despite how passionate you might feel about your project.
It's very wise. Those of you that are producers out here, you can probably appreciate what a great teammate is, somebody that can really write grants well. Dan, was that what attracted you to Lily initially?
Oh, no, but I'm not going there.
So
Fell in love with my buckskin dress.
So Katrina, let's talk about the importance and why Carnegie Mellon felt like this particular topic area of Indigenous legal history was so important and needed to have funding put behind.
I think what really sets our initiative apart is our interest in highlighting undertold stories. So for those who are interested, there is a pretty strong curriculum around federal Indian law, for instance, right? But that's not quite what we're proposing. We're proposing, again, this broader kind of landscape of ordinary Indigenous legal practice, right? Again, trying to convey the reality that Native people understood the structures that they were working with from the colonial period on, right? That had been a long-standing practice even prior to colonialism, to understand the protocols of other nations, to be able to respect those boundaries, but then also to repair those boundaries when breached. And so we wanted, through this initiative, to demonstrate that there is that day-to-day Indigenous legal history. There is that ordinary person's Native legal history, that it wasn't just about those who ended up in the Supreme Court or those even who signed treaties, in the midst of many different types of contexts, but that it was also about the powerful acts of women like those that Lily and Dan will be focusing on, to say that this act is wrong. And even if the federal government hasn't figured out how to define the rights that that these women as Native people had, they were going to articulate them themselves in court, right? And we're doing that in other areas of legal history as well. One of my partners works primarily in freedom suits in the antebellum era. Enslaved people would file petitions or suits to challenge their enslavement. And there are, frankly, hundreds of these cases in southern states and territories that really people don't recognize as a foundational push to freedom. A few people might know about the Dred Scott case in 1857, which was a freedom suit that went to the Supreme Court. But for one thing, Dred Scott was, again, one of hundreds of people who claimed freedom in local courts, and his was exceptional because it went to the Supreme Court. But then also, even though he lost his claim in the Supreme Court, other Black petitioners continued to push for freedom in local courts and did so. So overall, our team is really interested in thinking about how to introduce audiences to histories that, again, for us, we get to see this all the time because of the nature of our work. But I can write a book about it, I can write an article about it, and it won't reach the audience that we know that Vision Maker films will reach. And we also want to take advantage of multimedia platforms that will tell these stories in really dynamic and creative ways.
And speaking of that creative way of telling a story, when you have a story that you want to tell, Dan, and at the core of it, right, is a legal process. How do you balance that as a storyteller of telling a really good, interesting story, but also there's this sort of technical stuff that we have to include in that? How do you run the balance of how much you talk about the legal aspect and how much you focus on the story of what happened?
Well, that's the challenge that really attracted me to this whole project, because it does present a real challenge to balance everything out and to make it interesting and visually exciting enough to hold attention. Because, you know, we can drone on about and go through the testimony verbatim, and it's not going to fly. So I'm actually really excited about what we saw this morning with Johnny Carson and the possibility of diving into some of those new toys and seeing what we might be able to do to kind of dress this whole thing up. I'm also thinking about keeping it in the historic context as well, because this story originated in 1880s, 1890s. So video didn't exist. Film barely existed. Was there even a photographer in the courtroom as you were used to, you know, or was there even a sketch artist? And would that keep it, you know, going with some approach along that line, would that keep that historical context? So there's real challenges here, and that makes it a real exciting project for me.
Yeah, it could easily become just sort of a recitation of the notes from the court case. And so your role.
Oh, that'd be way too easy.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, your role as a storyteller is to compel people to care, right?
Yeah. I think one of the other things that is exciting about it is that when we start diving into the research and finding out these little tidbits of the stories that are will make it interesting. Just legal history in general. If you take a look at some of these court cases and you take a look at some of the things that were at stake for people. I mean, our woman died, our subject died in poverty when her husband made a fortune off the silver mining in Arizona. It's like, that's wrong. And if you take a look at other legal stories, lawsuits that originated in your own communities, you can see that the stakes are pretty high. And there's a lot of meat on those bones for a storyteller.
And they're not all big like Cobell. I mean, that was major. And that's kind of the culmination of this whole into the legal system and being disenfranchised by inheritance laws and being disenfranchised by the people who are supposed to be watching out for us. And these are a very personal, very small, you know, kind of a microcosm of that whole thing that happened all over this country for most tribes. I mean, the Osages lost millions and were murdered because of inheritance laws and their inheritance and what people saw as agreed and what people wanted. The whole push west of the tribes from the east, Cherokee, Choctaw, the 5 civilized tribes, and every other tribe that ever came into Indian territory. It's huge, but these women in a very small way stood up for themselves and one won and one lost. And they lost in state courts. They didn't lose in Supreme Courts. They never got that far, I don't think. But how it just sort of illustrates how ubiquitous that sort of greedy, grabbing culture used us and destroyed us, or tried to destroy us, and didn't manage. But that's my soapbox.
Well, and that recalls, if you haven't watched it, Lily and Dan produced a film that won an Emmy entitled Osage Reign of Terror. And that you sort of alluded to that film just a second ago. Similar territory, right? Because it was greed and people were murdered, and the legal system really didn't protect them. In fact, and oftentimes, as the film illustrates, it worked against them. So how do you see the connections between your earlier work and this project as you're moving forward? Tough one.
I think it comes down to the research. One thing we enjoyed about doing the Osage murder story was going back and visiting with people and hearing their stories and hearing about it on a very personal level. It wasn't just some story in a book somewhere. It was talking to these people face to face, and you can see it in their eyes, the pain that these families still feel. Getting that close to something means a lot, at least, to us, and particularly as you're trying to make a story out of it, to be able to see that emotion and to see what these people went through. And we hope to do the same thing with this. I mean, we're looking at microcosm, individuals. It's not some crazy article in a book about a Supreme Court something. It's a person. It's a family. That's the direct correlation between the two projects.
And that's one of the things I think as a storyteller, I've always tried to operate it under, right? The idea that the more personal a story is, the more universal it can be, because everybody has those feelings of wanting justice or wanting fairness or being taken advantage of in some points in their lives. So this is kind of a universal story in some ways in sharing that information. But at the same time, it's really interesting because I think you had folks in that film that were still alive. This sounds like it's a little bit earlier in its time frame. So have you thought through yet how you're going to try to get that same sort of emotion?
It's going to be tough. I mean, we had, for the Osage story, we had people we could talk to. With these stories, I don't know if anybody's still around. There may be some descendants. How connected they are to what actually happened 100 years ago is yet to be known. But that makes it tough.
And anytime you're doing a historical documentary, right, if there's not photographic evidence, if it's back earlier, it's a tough thing to think about. So that's, again, another reason why I think the partnership that Vision Maker has with the Carson Center is such an opportunity to think differently about how to tell the story visually. So I think it's a great partnership opportunity for those of you that are producers. So Katrina, can we talk just a little bit about the intent behind the focus here in the project and what you hope to accomplish at the end of the project?
Yeah, so this is currently, as you mentioned, a Mellon grant-funded initiative. And the goal for our first phase is to complete 2 documentary shorts around Indigenous legal history, and then also to publish our open educational resource, which will have a minimum of 500 archival documents pertaining to U.S. law and race that have been curated into these modules that are very teachable, very accessible to a broader public who are curious about what this interplay is between law and race. We also have a graduate fellowship program that brings 4 graduate students to the UNL campus each summer. And so we're hoping to mentor them in some of this historical storytelling around U.S. law and race. And they are also then contributing modules to the open educational resource. By the end of our 3 years, we hope that we can show compelling evidence of success in bringing these stories together and producing these documentary shorts and work toward distribution and also implementation. They're meant to be distributed in an educational context. And so we really want to see them active in classrooms. Again, this is part of Mellon's higher ed initiative. And so they're meant to be for a college age audience, but we're also making sure that these stories are appealing to their constituent communities and also to younger audiences as well. So we want to keep them, again, not so deep in the technical legal jargon that it would be alienating or boring. And so once we've completed that, our aim is to try to continue the program long-term and get more sustainable funding. I think it would be ideal to include Indigenous contributors, both from the scholarly side as well as from the filmmaking side long-term, because this is a really active space. I mean, just the title of our panel coming from Nick Estes' work, there's obviously a really vibrant community of scholars and creatives who are having these conversations, and we hope that we can both host some of that, but then also help to broaden the reach of those conversations.
And I know that we've talked about it a lot at our various meetings with the Vision Maker Board. You know, the framework of telling a story from an Indigenous perspective, right? How do you balance, again, as a storyteller, how do you balance that? We want this to be authentic and in our voice, but we also recognize it's going to be viewed widely by people who don't understand that. How do you balance that in your storytelling?
Been doing that since day one. Back to talking about when Frank got started and all that, you know, there was that attitude that I don't know if these Indians can do it. But so it's always been something. I don't know that that's something that I consciously think about much. It's like, I'm Comanche. I'm going to tell you in my Comanche style. I don't know how much more Indigenous I can get. And if you want something else, probably ought to find another producer.
I know as a person that works in public media, and I've been in public media for a really long time, we can be somewhat of a closed system, right? It can be difficult to get access as a producer. It can be difficult to submit work if you're not already employed at a station. And even within the station, sometimes you have to kind of fight a little bit to get your ideas and your stories heard. So how important is it for you as independent producers to be able to have access to resources like what you have in this project to be able to tell these stories?
Well, it's great. I mean, first of all, it means we don't have to do it all. You know, you can, well, when we first started, it was like, we got to do this and we got to do it with what we got. And it's you and me. But with this partnership, I think being able to access the research interns, being able to work with Vision Maker, looking at what's going on at the Johnny Carson setup. There's so much talent out there but we hide. I mean, it's hard to find. At least back in the day it was. I mean, back when we started talking about it, there were Dan and Phil, what's his name? Phil Lucas.
Phil Lucas.
And Gary Robinson. Those were the guys, you know, that did video production. And they knew each other. And you had to, you know, turn over rocks to find shooters and sound people and anybody that could help you in any aspect of a production. And then, well, the Institute of American Indian Arts developed their video school or catalog courses, and it became a little easier because you could find people that had some training. I mean, I have none. I just write, and I do research, and I'm pretty good at it. But finding people that have, well, and I'm deaf in one ear, so I certainly can't do sound. So we got to find people that can help us out. And it's interesting how much bigger that community's become due to the efforts of Vision Maker through Frank and now Francine, and places like the Institute of American Indian Arts, and then people willing to mentor younger producers coming up. It's we're old school. We're like she says, we're old. And it's young people come with all these fresh ideas, so we like to take advantage of that.
So Katrina, can we talk a little bit about the project itself and how can the broader community, both indigenous and non-indigenous, collaborate and work together as part of this project?
Well, we're excited about putting these archival materials in the hands of Native writers and filmmakers, and seeing, how that really shapes and completes the storytelling version of it. But we're also excited about the fact that our graduate research assistants and our graduate fellows are being introduced to this importance of community collaboration, of multidisciplinary collaboration as a fundamental aspect of their scholarship. That's another part of, I think, what Mellon appreciated with our proposal is that for all of the members of the Mellon team, our work has always been based in an ethics of community accountability and responsibility. And so this allows us to benefit from expertise that we don't have on our team. I'm learning so much just in working with Dan and Lily, and then even being in audience with other folks about what is behind production and filmmaking. And so for us, it's a really tremendous learning experience. Even if it can seem like we're providing some scholarly expertise, I feel like in many ways, I'm also a student in this process. In terms of community, we're hoping that through open access that, sort of a member of the general public would really have a chance to think more deeply about some of their misperceptions about the nature of the American legal tradition, that in fact, the American legal tradition is densely populated by a variety of actors. And that what we know from the top down, from a focus on the Supreme Court, is of course important in noting benchmarks in US history, but is not at all reflective of, again, that day-to-day legal tradition and practice that Indigenous and other people engaged with at lots of different levels. And so we're hoping for non-Native audiences that this will give them a chance to see, some of that history and apply that history to their current view of Native communities and nations, since obviously sovereignty is an active, continues to reappear before the Supreme Court. We would like general audiences to really be more firmly educated about what the implications and histories are in those kinds of cases as they come up to the Supreme Court. But then also for Native audiences, we'd like to support more of those connections. Lily mentioned that there are lots of families who know parts of their history, and there are still questions, right, about, well, how did that work? How did that happen? And again, based on the type of archival work that our team does, it turns out that a lot of that is actually available. There is, again, abundant evidence of the way Native people have challenged these personal wrongs, as well as the political implications of those personal wrongs. And so our hope is that we can sort of offer some support and also incentive to do some of that research behind those sort of, again, persistent family questions that might come up at gatherings of like, I wonder exactly what was behind that. And that was sort of how a lot of the research to start finding these cases came from. And just as an example, every jurisdiction that we've looked in, there are Native litigants. That alone, I think, should tell us that this isn't something that one person can do, right? So we want to, again, advocate for Native communities to be able to really be confident in going into those archives that they will find their relatives.
So we're going to open things up for questions in just a minute. So be thinking of your excellent questions. Dan, Lily, whoever wants to take this, this is a question I always hate when people ask me when I'm starting a production, when will we get to see For My Children?
What's our deadline?
The day before that deadline.
I feel that in my soul, believe me. All right, let's take a few minutes. And again, if you're watching us on Whova, please submit your questions. We'd be happy to ask those for you. So folks in the room here, have any questions you'd like to ask Dan, Lily, or Katrina? Okay, we have a microphone. We'll forget our folks on Whova so they can hear, right?
First of all, I'd like to commend you up there because your work really emphasizes the agency of Indigenous people rather than just seeing them as unrelenting victims in the 19th century. But my question is primarily for Katrina. As you were describing the project at the very beginning, quotation from, I believe, Ta-Nehisi Coates came to my mind, where race is the child of racism, not the father. How do you think that your work in your research kind of supports that narrative or that truth?
So one of the things that we feature in the curriculum is a conversation about where does race start to emerge in the American legal tradition. And when you look at the colonial period, it's obvious that Europeans really were unsure how to categorize non-Europeans. And so there are lots of different examples of identifying Indigenous people as sovereign nations. There are examples of identifying Indigenous people as potential kin and relatives. And there are examples, I think, as, you know, to sort of the way you opened your comment, of identifying Indigenous people as dehumanized enemies, right? When you also introduce the practice of slavery to that, then there's a dual and overlapping effort to define African people and where they sort of fit into this colonial frame. And here I'm speaking very specifically about the North American context. This plays out differently across the world. And also when I say colonial period, it's not necessarily one fixed period of time, because these colonial processes repeated themselves over time across North America. And so what we want to show are these legal documents that demonstrate this fluidity and the sort of possibility of many different types of relationships and categories, and then chronicle the way that they became closer to what we recognize today. And the purpose of doing that does support that sense that race is a construction in some ways, but of course, at no point are we missing the reality that race represents a lot of different things. Phenotype is one of those, but it also is cultural status, political status, legal status, personal status. And so our focus is really looking at the contingency of race in the law and encouraging new readers of that kind of documentary record to ask, then why do we kind of have such fixed notions of this in the 21st century? Hopefully that answers that question. We spend years in that question, by the way, so.
Hi. So my name is Tatiana, and I do almost identical research, but I don't have quite the support out of Tulsa, Oklahoma. You hear about Killers of the Flower Moon all the time. This was an Indian story across Indian territory. And when I started this, I finally had to narrow it down to Tulsa, Oklahoma. My family's research alone, which is what started it, is very overwhelming. And it's like you said, which direction do you take it? There's a legal aspect. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a humble Indian who just started looking into my family's history because now it's more available, and it's a lot. And then there's the emotional, the personal aspect, the boarding schools. Land allotment, theft went hand in hand with boarding schools, tearing down the fabric and spirit of the American Indian family. So doing this, it feels like primarily by myself, is very overwhelming. And I think what I would kind of like to know is how have you kind of separated it? Like the story you were talking about, the mines. For us, it was land, it was oil, and apparently it wasn't illegal to marry an Indian because that's what they did. They marry into the family, and the Indian days were numbered. I have that in our family. I have full-bloods in our family and who became the victims of guardians. It was relentless. And even after everything was gone and they tried to rebuild their lives, they took that too. So how do you tell that story? And that's kind of, I've kind of got the ear of the University of Tulsa because they have a project. Muskogee Nation's involved, but it's still very whitewashed. And when you hear what I have to say, they don't want to hear it because they have the Tulsa Race Massacre. So they don't want to be involved in more. They don't. And then I have the bureaucracy of the tribal government that I have to get that also before Tulsa will really listen. It's all very, very challenging.
Well, it really is. But as if you have a story, you have to be ruthless and stick to your story. What's important for that story? You can't, I've seen people make the mistake of, at least in my culture, my tribe, trying to tell the Wounded Knee story every time we tell a story. Well, let's stick to your story. You can't, and it's hard. It's really hard because there's so many things that impinge, especially in the development of this nation and the subjugation of Native peoples and, the land grab and the boarding schools and just everything. Even it carries forward today. When my folks opened a grocery store at Pine Ridge on the reservation, they couldn't get a bank loan because it's the reservation. And you don't have any collateral that they can have anymore. You can't put up your land because it can't pass out of the tribe. So it's all of those things that affect us. I mean, it's like, and how do you tell that story? You just got to pick apart a piece of it and tell that part. Yeah, well. Yeah. That's
that's
because we're not okay with it.
part of my Comanche style. I am not okay with it. And my story is not going to be okay with it. It's wrong.
I love that. Thank you. We love to say at Vision Maker, Francine says it on a daily basis. You all are storytellers. It's your story. It's your story. I love that you don't even need a mic to tell your story from the back of the room. So thank you. If there's no more questions from the audience, we'll turn to
I would like to add a comment to it. Lily's right. You got to pick that part of the information that you have, make that your story, and stay focused on that. If you get too distracted, everybody's going to miss your point. Find that point, focus in, zero in on it, and be ruthless. That's your story.
Hi, my question is just more to the fact of you mentioned standing bare. and how he went to court and initiated habeas corpus and was recognized as a person. And so during that time of like 1879, prior to that, there has been institutions of litigation by the government, like, for example, the 1872 general mining law, which is still in existence to today. And so being from the Southwest, we have a lot of different issues involving uranium mining, specifically around the Grand Canyon, which is still instituting the 1872 mining law and has been able to still mine due to these due to the pre-existing mines that are there. So currently right now, there's uranium being extracted in the Grand Canyon region. And even though they were able to make it a monument, they still were able to exercise the 1872 law and continue mining because that's a pre-existing mine. So I guess my question is in the sense of resource extraction, in the sense of even too water rights in the Southwest, the Navajo Nation recently gained water rights, but to what extent? We have the Winters Doctrine of 1908, which says that you can have allocation to water rights, whatever that you need in order to sustain livelihood. And so still in those litigations, there were no Navajos that were present. There were no Hopis that were present. And so we have these laws that had dwindled the allocation to what could potentially have been more. And I think in a lot of sense, like me being from the Northern Arizona region and seeing all that water that's being sent to the municipalities through the CAP, the Central Arizona Project, to Maricopa County, to Phoenix, Tucson. And so, yeah, I just wanted to mention that there is a definite need for funding for these stories, especially when addressing the legality that's been overlooked when it comes to who we are as Native people, and just the time frame of like Standing Bear, 1879, and then the 1872 mining law, and still in those pretenses that we weren't seen as human. And so how can we backtrack, or how can we claim in a lot of ways what resources we need to survive?
So one of the things that we want to demonstrate in the way we study and analyze law is that law is not an objective system. It's not a universal system. It's not a system. It's sort of like in the previous panel, the sense that technology is neutral, right? But we know that not to be true because technology is developed by humans with biases who have their own sort of worldview and frame that they're referencing from. Law is exactly the same. It is a technology that's developed in particular contexts and has variations across the world and across time. And I think once you start to understand the sort of malleability of law, then you can push on it. And that's one of the things that I think is so compelling about the area of sovereignty as a field of study, is that it's a place where you can really see dynamism in the law and change over time. And so obviously these issues with sovereign nations, resource extraction that you're pointing to are, I think what we need to remember is that those are active areas of law. And so there's this sense that there's a principle, that there's jurisprudence, but again, fundamentally, those were invented and they have been restructured and they can be reviewed and they can be revised. And so that's something that I hold on to as a legal scholar in thinking in terms of the history is the future, right? That yes, we have these historical frameworks, but frankly, they're not very old, right? And mining law is just I think a it's bizarre to me that we are so interested in innovation in the 21st century, and yet we're still using 19th century law for mining practice, right? Where is the innovation in that? I will also say that, you know, part of our interest in this kind of initiative is to expand the conversation about Indigenous legal history. And Standing Bear's case is a really powerful example of Indigenous legal sophistication that has unfortunately been really misconstrued in the 20th century and 21st century. Being from Arizona, I hope you enjoy knowing that in 1871, a Yaqui woman filed habeas against a territorial senator to retain custody of her children. And that was 8 years before Standing Bear. In 1868 in Kansas, Sac and Fox leader Keokuk used habeas for the exact same reason as Standing Bear. He won in the Kansas Supreme Court. He got a settlement of $1,000 for having been wrongfully arrested, and he kept tribal status. And I'm fairly certain that Standing Bear understood this legal practice, took it to Nebraska, and then faced a judge who had chosen not to educate himself on federal Indian law at all, and for that reason was naive and racist enough to ask if Indians are human. But prior to 1879, even to think about like the first Delaware Treaty in 1778, which is considered to be one of the first US treaties, clearly American legal actors know that they are dealing with Native people who are human and have legal rights, right? So to me, what's fascinating about the Standing Bear case is, of course, everything that Standing Bear and the other Ponca petitioners did to try to return to their land. But I would like us to think about Standing Bear's case in terms of the century before. How can a federal judge be so ignorant of federal Indian law in 1879, a century in to US Indigenous legal interaction at local and federal courts, to not know how to deal with Standing Bear, right? And then a century later, the Northern Ponca are detribalized. They have to work to get federal recognition and restoration. They then lose their tribal status under the process of termination in the 1950s and the 1980s when they appeal to try to get restored. What do Nebraska senators do? They say that they will not approve it unless the federal government promises not to give the Northern Ponca land rights. So it's important 100 years later as well, right? And so I think this is our interest, is inviting scholars and filmmakers to work together to really broaden this conversation and to demonstrate that the law has sort of consistently, in the hands of Indigenous people, been an act of power and storytelling, and it can continue to be that moving forward.
Wow, thank you so much for that. Wonderful, wonderful. I learned a lot, and I can tell that we could all just sit and talk about this all day and make things happen. We have time for one quick question from a Hoover guest, and then we're headed in the right direction and staying on time. So thank you for that. Our question comes from Marla Williams, and it's just a quick question about how does one request archival assistance through this project? So I think it's more of a funding question. Any thoughts?
Hello, this is Francine, and Director of Vision Maker Media. And so to answer your question, what you do is you go to our website, visionmakermedia.org, click on Fund Your Film. You'll find it under the Creative Shorts and also under Special Projects, and it's there as Indigenous Law History. And you can click on that, learn the criteria, the guidelines, and how to submit a proposal. The other thing is, in the proposal can be also in kind of sort of a sense of research and development. It can be a concept, and it can get developed out into a full production. So if you have the idea, but you don't know quite yet how to really go about articulating the process and the storyline and the research and things like that, that's okay. You can go ahead and submit with a concept, and then we review it. If it's a topic we want to choose, we'll begin to work with you.
Thank you for that. Thank you to this wonderful panel.